So I started the recording, and we're just gonna start on time. Welcome to the American Civil Rights and I Roundtable. My name is Yanmei Wang, and I am the host for today's roundtable. I grew up in the People's Republic of China and came here for college when I was 18. For most of my life, I have been a physicist, and now as an activist in West Windsor, I have been actively involved in a number of community issues, including the civil rights issue we are discussing today, the observance of MLK Day. Now I turn over to YZ for introduction of the panel.
Hello, my name is YZ. My full name is Ying Chao Zhang, but make it simple and short. If you don't want to be a friend of mine, then you can call me XYZ. So I'm the co-host and also panelist. So I was also a physicist like Yanmei in the past. So I got my PhD in nuclear physics coming from China for graduate school. And now I'm a community activist myself and entrepreneur in technology. I'm also a former WWP school board member and also West Windsor Council and the Council Vice President for 1 year. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. First, Diane Chikong is a lawyer, everything, right? Yeah. She's a former West Windsor Council President and community activist across the board, serving West Windsor as a Colgate University alumni. And the second guest next to Diane, Daryl McLean, is the IT professional whose potential was discovered earlier and later helped realized by a Better Chance program for talented students of color. Welcome, Daryl.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next, Grace Tian. She is a sociologist and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. Prior to her PhD program, she taught in the inner city of Baltimore through Teach for America. Hello, Grace. It's my pleasure to get to know her through some common friends. So very glad to be able to have her on the panel today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last but not the least, Lamercia Rose Tiget is a lawyer specializing in consumer protection, employment and labor laws, and civil rights litigations. Lamercia is also a Democratic Committee member of West Windsor Township and a local activist with a passion for dismantling systemic injustice by empowering through education. So thank you all, the panel, for joining us. Back to Yanmei.
While we all know about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we might not all be familiar with the impact the 1960s civil rights movement that he helped lead has on our day-to-day lives. So we organized this roundtable and invited Chinese American and African American residents from West Windsor and Princeton, New Jersey, to share with us their life stories related to the civil rights movement. And you might ask, why Chinese Americans and African Americans? We were arguably the two previously most discriminated and or rejected minority groups in the U.S. history. Although we were both brought here for the purposes of labor, the Chinese, though compensated, were banned from immigration to the U.S. by Chinese exclusion laws after the completion of the Continental Railroad. The Africans enjoyed no such compensation. They arrived here solely as cargo, stripped of their identity, native language, ancestry, and culture, and were forced to build America's economy with their free labor. And we hope that with our stories, we can find that the 1960s civil rights movement really changed the lives of both groups in dramatically similar and yet starkly different ways. And we'll use the format of questions to introduce the stories of our panelists. The first question is for Ying Chao and Grace. Most Chinese residents here today, including the ones in our seminar, came to the U.S. after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that was passed at the peak of the Civil Rights Movement. This is the act that removed the 105 person per year immigration quota from the People's Republic of China. And after this act, most Chinese that came here, first as graduate students and immigrated after securing a job mostly in tech sectors, in STEM fields, and become middle class to upper middle class Americans with one of the highest median annual household income among American ethnic groups. I believe this is how Ying Chao immigrated from the People's Republic of China and how Grace's parents immigrated from Taiwan. So please share with us your stories.
I'll let Grace talk first. Go ahead. Yeah, lady first, right?
Oh, sure. Okay. May, a quick question. Is there background noise on your end? Sorry, I think it was a bit distracting for everyone. So we all muted ourselves, but I just want to reiterate the question because I think we all might have been a little bit distracted by the background noise. So you're asking us to share just like from our parents, or in YZ's case, his personal experience, right, of immigration and just how they came here to the States, correct? Okay. Sure. So I can start. My parents came here in the 1980s from Taiwan. My father came here for graduate school. So there's a sociologist at Columbia, her name is Jennifer Lee, who's written about this, actually. She's written about the immigration patterns of just Asians from different parts of East Asia and South Asia. And she essentially makes the argument that one of the reasons why Asian Americans on the whole have been able to, I guess, like have not experienced perhaps the same levels of inequality or discrimination that some other underrepresented minority groups have experienced is because in part a lot of them were immigrating or coming over for graduate school, like my father, who came here for a master's program and eventually actually was going to do a PhD. And my mother was not, but they both were first generation like collegiates. So they were the first people in their families to go to, well, actually not my father, but from my mother's side, like she was the first person in her family to go to university. So when they came over here to the States, like, yes, they definitely faced a lot of challenges. They were, they were definitely living under the poverty line at a certain point. They were, they faced a lot of different challenges, like when they first came here to the States, financially, socially, culturally, there were a lot of challenges to overcome. So for that reason, I, for myself, like as a second generation, like I'm always like forever grateful to my parents because I know like how much they've had to overcome in terms of like racial discrimination, bias in the workplace, just general things that like a lot of immigrants like you have to figure out on your own when you're here without family or friends to support you. So I think I see all those things that my parents have gone through. Yet at the same time, I think because of the opportunity, like they also had to go into a graduate program for my father on my father's side. My mother actually became a full-time homemaker, but my father ended up working in also in technology management, also in IT management, actually, like Mr. Darrell. So I think over time, like our family circumstances were able to gradually improve. And I from what I saw from my parents, and like they always sought to give my brother and myself like opportunities to learn. And I can't say like we grew up in in a very like wealthy neighborhood or anything like that. But I never felt like I was wanting for anything when I was growing up. Even though, like, for example, I can't say like I ever felt like, oh, I can have like the nicest things or the most updated things that some of my classmates would have, yeah, so it was, I think we had like our family definitely had to like overcome different challenges like when they came here first. But over time, what I saw is, there definitely was like there were definitely like paths towards growth and improvement. I think in the last few years, especially though, I've had some conversations with my family about racial injustices and racial inequality, and especially this past year, 2020, with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the events that happened. I think I've had some really just some really encouraging conversations actually with my family, because I think immigrants who come here first, they tend to take on the mindset of, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You got to like work really hard. And I think my parents are no different. So I think at first, like in their minds, they're kind of like, well, some people who just don't work hard, like maybe like they can't improve because they haven't been working hard or they haven't been doing what they're supposed to be doing. But Martin Luther King actually gave a really interesting like speech some time ago, where he said, you're telling the Black man or the Black woman to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He's like, when they don't even have like boots on, and he's like, how can you tell someone without boots on to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? So I think, and then this is a conversation I had with my father too. I said, Dad, when you came here for graduate school, like you at least had some family financial support, not a lot, but still a little bit, some family support that like brought you here to the States. In contrast to, to African Americans, our Black brothers and sisters, like they came here as Yamei mentioned earlier, they came here as human cargo. So like that's like a whole nother layer of history that just like, immigrants have not had to deal with here in the States. But anyway, so that's from my end. I'd love to hear from YZ.
Yeah, it's a very good perspective. Can you hear me loud and clear? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if look at a bigger picture perspective, other than the first immigration from China to help build the cross-continental railroad, then the different waves of immigrants come in. I came with a wave of graduate students coming to U.S. for higher education, because I came to America in 1989. That's when China was still pretty poor as a country, and economy is not strong. So the students usually come from China. They usually have undergrad education already in China and coming to America for higher education, like PhD and master degree programs and so on. So there is a phenomena for us to compare, to say how much money we have in our pocket when we land to US. Like, how much money you have? Like 40, I have 20, okay, I win. I have only $10. So the reason is that at the time, really only sort of the quote unquote academically top of the classes were able to come to America, because they were the ones able to get the sponsorship from the university, like in terms of teaching or research assistantship, right? So that's the big wave coming, very much similar to Grace's parents' story. It's just different time, because prior to that, mainland China was a closed society, and citizens couldn't come out of China, of course, kind of like North Korea today, right? But after that, after the Chinese government applied the open door policy, immigrants start from coming over. So while, to Grace's second point, while the student came over without much money in the pocket, but they had a great opportunity because of their degree in China, and also because of the acceptance by the graduate school in US, they were set up to be quote unquote successful in whatever specialized career, most likely in a STEM area, because that's where as a country, US actually needs, or still needs, and needed and still needs lots of talents all over the world, because of sometimes lack of enough talents in certain field. So I think that's really that's kind of continue until now. one of my concerns related to that is the shutting the door on that kind of flow of immigrants from China and elsewhere also. I think it'll be a huge mistake for America to stop that kind of immigration, because the country needs people like that, talent, and to build economy and make it a vibrant society and country. So I think that's just a side point. But again, to Grace's second point, I think when my generation come to America, while we were poor to begin with, we were given a tremendous opportunity. So to that extent, myself and all my peers feel hugely appreciation for the opportunity for America as a country to welcome people like us to come over. But of course, when we come here, then we learn over time the history and all the discrimination, including the Chinese Exclusion Act. In fact, I didn't know that when I was in China, or I first came to America. I learned that afterwards, by reading and listening to other people's talk. So I'll stop for now, but I know because we have a lot of other great topics to cover. But thank you.
Thank you, Yin Chao. Yeah, again, yes, just like you said, America is a land of opportunity. That's the reason I come here. And I think that's a lot of reason for a lot of us are here, because we're here for the opportunity that America can present to us. So this past November, we lost Lucille Bridges, who, after the Supreme Court declared that separating schools for Black and white children to be unconstitutional, sent her 6-year-old daughter, Ruby Bridges, to a New Orleans all-white elementary school as the first Black child in 1960. So this question is for Diane and Daryl, that you went to school at about the same time as Ruby. And would you describe to us your experience as the first batches of students in integrated schools at that time? And I will imagine the situation to be a lot different up north in New York State comparing to southern states.
Well, thank you for the question. So I really want to start with some history, because I think, as Yang Mei said, African Americans came over as chattel. And the United States, the Constitution, the institutions were all designed to keep the Black man and woman subservient. We look at, you could read the Constitution, 3/5 of the southern states were able to have 3/5 count to slaves. The Electoral College is based on the North versus the Southern slave states. So then you had Black codes where it was illegal for Blacks to learn how to read and write. When they came out of the Civil War, Reconstruction, then you had the Jim Crow laws. So when you look at Brown versus the Board that was in 1954, that's in my lifetime. And even though the Constitution said it was illegal, unconstitutional for segregation, the schools really never became desegregated. It was slow in the South, it was slow in the North. You look at school system today, the better school systems are based on zip codes, based on wealth. So not only do you have educational discrimination, you have housing discrimination. So that's sort of the backdrop. So I was raised in central New York, and I lived in a town that there are only a few Black families, so I was never segregated in terms of going to different school, because you couldn't afford to have a school for maybe a couple children. The difference is that the mindset of the educators when they looked at a Black child was the same as it was if you were in a segregated school. So I recall when I was getting ready to go to college, and I was the first in my family to go to college, my college counselor said, "You can't get into any college." And then I flipped forward. My daughter graduated from West Windsor Plainsboro High School, and the guidance counselor in 2006, the guidance counselor said exactly the same thing. So that kind of shows you that even though institutionally the schools are supposed to be integrated now, the mindset has never changed, and so many people. And so that's what I think we still have to work on, is changing the mindset of people, that everyone has the right and the ability to excel if you give them the opportunities, the access, and the tools in which to do that. So I'll turn it over to Daryl.
My name is Daryl McMillan. I didn't grow up in those areas. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York at the time of the 1950s all the way to the 1960s. My experience is a lot different because the schools that I went to, because I started going to school in East New York, were already integrated. For the most part, they were integrated, and something that I didn't notice till I got into my, I guess, close to my secondary years, was that it seemed that even though the number of African American students in the school changed over time, all of the white kids were in my class. So there was some kind of, thing going on with the teachers and such that in order to in quotes, protect these kids, they always ended up in the gifted class, which is the class that I was in. I grew up with probably about maybe 10 out of the 30 kids were African American. And if you looked at, I know at least in junior high school, junior high school is about 95% African American, and my class was about 80% Caucasian. So something actually was going on there when Diane is talking about some of the things that are in place to make sure that, you didn't really succeed at what you're doing. Part of it is they never gave you the boots to put the straps on, You were actually there, and no matter what you did, you really had a lot to overcome. I was actually very lucky in that respect because I became part of this scholarship program that they call the Better Chance. Now, a Better Chance was created because of the 60s and all of the things that went on in the 60s to make it such that there should be programs to help gifted students, which we would call at that time, get into some of the better schools and actually go to school in some of the better areas in the country. I was part of a program that sent kids to prep schools around the country. And because of that, I got to go to a very good school in New York City. And from there, I went to a fairly good college in Massachusetts. One thing I will say is we did have a set of integration issues because of some of the things that Diane already said, there was not a lot of real integration in the schools. So New York City started to do what they call busing. And what they did was take my set of buildings, which were the projects, as they call them, and take us and ship us over across a major highway to another school so that they could integrate that school. And there was a big ruckus going on between all the different groups of parents. And one of my favorite stories, my mother tells me this story, so I'm going to tell you guys this, that she went to the PTA meeting, and the PTA meeting is with all the parents sitting there. And one of the ladies got up and said, well, my kids never came home cursing until your kids came to this school. And my mother said to her, well, then how do you know what these words are if you never had this going on in your house? Why are you going to accuse us, right, when it's just something that naturally occurs and we didn't bring it to your school? You're just noticing it now. I went to, a little more of this. I went to a fairly good high school, and I'm going to say I had a similar experience as Diane had coming out of school, and I went to a really good school. I got into every college that I applied to, but my guidance counselor didn't think I would get into any of them, and he tried to get me to go to these schools that just were not up to the standard of the schools I was trying to get into. But it's all because I'm not supposed to do that well. I was one of the few kids in my high school, which is a very good high school, that got into all the schools that they actually applied to. So it became kind of a little bit of an issue with us that I was doing fairly good when I got out of there. I'm not going to say any more, so I'm going to give it on to Macy.
Macy, you're on mute. Sorry, you have to unmute.
I think May is going to say the next question, and then that's when I'm going to take it.
May, you're on mute too.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, 60 years today, 60 years after the ending of segregations in schools, the number of segregated schools in reality, meaning schools with high ratios of students of specific racial or ethnic groups, is in fact increasing, especially over the past 20 years when the school integration push has ended, while most low-income African American families were still concentrated in inner cities. And for the remaining of this seminar, I will call these schools newly defined segregated schools. And this question is for Lanisha, that please share with us your experience in your newly defined segregated schools in your childhood, where expectations for the students were not necessarily best structured for your success later in life.
Well, taking over from where Miss Diane and Mr. Darrell left off, so they grew up when schools were segregated. Finally, there came a period when schools were integrated. Just because, and like they said, just because the schools were integrated doesn't mean they were designed for the success of all the children in the schools. So you had African American children like me going to a segregated school, going to an integrated school, and I'm doing fine. I'm acing all the tests because the way they measured your standard of success was through standardized testing in my day. So in the second grade, I take the standardized test. I'm testing as a sixth grader. So even though I'm in the second grade, I'm performing the reading, comprehension, writing, cognitive ability of a sixth grader. By the time I get to the sixth grade and I take the standardized test again, I'm now performing so highly, my reports come back as too high to grade, or they can't even compute the level that I'm operating on because I'm beyond it says, I think it actually said college or higher, because I was in the sixth grade, but comprehending, performing, excelling like a 12th grader in the sixth grade. And what happened to me happens to a lot of Black children. So most of us don't have the track that Mr. Darrell had where somebody actually looks and says, oh, you're doing good. Let me pluck you out of there and put you into a program where your skill set can actually be challenged and you can go as far as your potential will take you. I learned from Mr. Darrell what happened to me was something called tracking. And Mr. Darrell, you can jump in anytime to explain it. But basically, when they don't know what to do with a child as smart as me, they just drop us in a classroom. And eventually, boredom is going to set in. So what started happening to me is in the seventh grade, I was bored out of my mind. So I would cut class. And then when it was test time, I would come back and I would ace all the tests. And I did this like every semester. And my teachers were flabbergasted. They were like, she's not here. How is she doing this? Well, because you're like, in sixth grade, I'm operating as a 12th grader. You're not doing anything to challenge me beyond that. So this went on for a number of years. And I was doing the same thing and nobody could understand. But nobody took the initiative to find out or to place me in gifted and talented, or even if we even had that available, nobody did anything. And then when I as I would transfer to schools, because we were food challenged. My mom, although she had a heck of a job, she worked 25 years. My mom never missed a day out of work. We still battled homelessness because she was a single parent doing it on her own. So I would go and I would take these tests, ace all the tests, but just wouldn't go to school because it was like, this is not challenging. I can literally spend a week in your presence and ace all your tests. And that's exactly what I was doing. So moving forward, as we changed schools, my guidance counselors would just put me in a classroom. They wouldn't put me in a classroom that would challenge me. They didn't look at me and say, oh, you're smart or you're good in math, so you're going to do this. They would just look at me and say, oh, you're not going to perform. We're going to stick you over here. No problem. And so when I did perform, I guess they had to answer for it. Maybe they didn't, probably not. By the 11th grade, I remember the day that I quit school. I went to class. I was in math class, and the teacher says, "You remember the number line, right?" And she got up on the board. She got up to the board. She took a piece of chalk. I remember like it was yesterday. She started to draw the number line. And I had a flashback because when I started, my father, he's a deceased now. He was a computer programmer. And back in the day, to be a computer programmer, you had to be hecka smart because you had to actually write the code to make the computer run. And I remember having a flashback to one of my days in first grade when I was in private school and Miss Villa was teaching me the number line on the chalkboard. And I said, it's 11th grade and you are still teaching the number line? I signed myself out that day. I said, I'm done. Because it's a waste of my time. In the 11th grade, there's no way you should be teaching inner city kids the number line. The number line is how you teach addition and subtraction. So I was done with it. But this is the plight of what African American children go through because they're housed by their zip code or restrained by the lack of income or financial resources in their specific communities. They never get to experience what a fulsome education is. And so this is when you start to see them acting out and exhibiting, it's just boredom because they have nothing else to do. So that's how I performed in school. Now, once I signed myself out, I went to college. I was a single mom. I got pregnant at 19, had a son. But then, right after I had my son, because I'm a grown woman now, signed myself into college, graduated one program, magna cum laude, 3.5. Went to Rider University, graduated there, magna cum laude, 3.5, and went on to law school because all these schools did what my primary education would not do. They challenged me and they gave me the opportunity to show that I could excel if you just gave me the chance.
Well, thank you for sharing with us the wonderful experience. This question is for Grace. You were a teacher for the Teach for America program for 2 years. Before in the school that was in the toughest area in Baltimore. And the school was ranked among the bottom 10 out of the more than 600 schools in Maryland. And more than 99% of the students there were Black from low-income families. Would you describe your experience teaching there?
Sure. So right out of college, I joined a program called Teach for America, which is run by like a larger federal program called AmeriCorps, which also runs the Peace Corps. So then I was assigned to Baltimore, and the particular school I joined was located in Northwest Baltimore. And my school, in terms of demographics, was 99% African American. I think there was maybe one other teacher in the school who was Filipino, so of like an South Asian origin. But when I was teaching my kids, I have a distinct memory of my kids asking me one day. They're like, one student says, "Miss Tian, like, you're white, aren't you?" And I say to them, "No, actually, I am not white." I'm like, my parents are from, my ancestors are actually from China, but my parents are from Taiwan. And I had to like kind of connect it to Chinese takeout to get them to like kind of get the connection, that I was not white. I told them like, yeah, my parents actually were not born here in the States, but I was born here, like you guys. And it was, yeah, that I have to say, like, I mean, I loved my students, and I think my students knew that. On the other hand, it was also like definitely like in my 20s, it was definitely like the toughest experience of my 20s. But I'm so thankful that I had that opportunity, because I think, I mean, I grew up in suburban New Jersey. I tell people I grew up around cows and farmland in Hillsborough. But I think being placed in the inner city environment just gave me a perspective I could not possibly have had, had I not gone there to teach and to just really engage with my kids, their parents, the community. And I think, yeah, it was tough, because obviously there were a lot of cultural things that I didn't understand either. There were things that were really new to me. I wasn't able to code switch. I'll explain what code switch means, for if there's any immigrants or Asian Americans in the audience who don't really understand. Code switching is you're able to kind of speak almost like a different dialect. When we say there's different dialects in Chinese, code switching is kind of like that. You're able to switch into another dialect and be able to use certain terms, certain jargon that people otherwise would not know. But I had a colleague who I'm still really close with to this day, and she she's African American, but her mother sent her to an all white Catholic all girls school. So she knows how to code switch between, on the phone she can sound like a white person, people might think oh, and her mother purposely gave her a white name like Megan, but then she can also code switch really effectively, back into, just and sound just like an African American who grew up in Baltimore. So I noticed when she was engaging with kids, she was able to meet them in a way that I wasn't able to. It was they looked at her and they saw their mom, and they're like, oh, she's like my mom, whereas, I think to my kids, I probably seemed a little bit more of an outsider, but on the other hand, I think my kids, I still grew that relationship with my kids, and they all knew I really cared about them, and I loved them, and I wanted them to succeed. And I think when I started out as a first year teacher, I of course had very little knowledge of classroom management. And classroom management, I think classroom management in any school district is tough for a first year teacher. But I think in my district, or in my school, where my kids actually the year before, so I was teaching second graders, and I was teaching them social studies and language arts. And my kids the year before in first grade didn't even have a teacher, actually. So their first grade teacher pretty much left after a couple months, and they just never were able to hire a replacement teacher for them. So my kids had no sense of classroom structure. They were running around the school. They didn't understand what it was to sit in a classroom and learn. So when they came to my classroom, I had to, with the other teacher who was a veteran at this school, and together she and I both, actually we struggled a lot to just really instill to our kids what classroom structure looked like and what it was. So yeah, I struggle with that so much every single day, and I felt like a failure every single day. But I think I don't know how it happened, but somehow by the end of the year, my kids were able to actually perform. So I think over 80% of my kids started out not being able to read, or scoring way below grade level for their reading level. But by the end of the year, over 50% of my kids were reading at grade level, or even at 2, 3, 4, 5 grade levels above second grade. So I was just wow, that's a miracle. That's God's grace, because I did not, yeah, I honestly, I felt there were so many times I'm I wondered with my level of experience as a teacher, and just the way I was, yeah, just the way that I was, not able to handle classroom management effectively. I wondered are my kids learning, but yeah, I think, I know there were some comments in the chat, so I'll try to address that quickly too. Just someone asked if I have had experiences in school like Daryl and Diane. I think that's a really great question, and it actually goes back to the sociologist I quoted earlier. I'm going to put her name in the chat, sociologist Jennifer Lee. If anyone wants to look up her work, you can Google her. She's at Columbia University. But she wrote a really great book that talks about how Asian Americans don't get the same kind of discrimination that Black Americans do. Because when an Asian American is in a school, I don't think guidance counselors look at Asian Americans the same way and think like, oh, like you're not going to be able to achieve academically. You're not going to be able to get into these schools. Like I've never had a guidance counselor like say that to me, like what Miss Diane or Mr. Daryl experienced. But on the other hand, like I have experienced, like if we're talking about like racial discrimination in other ways, like yes, like I've experienced that in school, and in other ways in growing up in a completely, like I was the only Asian kid in my classroom most of my life. So yeah, there of course, like there's different kinds of discrimination, but definitely I think that level of discrimination of like that expectation, and this is what the sociologist Jennifer Lee is writing about. She's saying like even that expectation that schools have like for Asian Americans or Asian kids, or Black kids, like it can be vastly different, but that makes a difference, right? Because that makes a difference in terms of the kind of attention a teacher gives to a student, right? It makes a difference in the kind of attention that and care that like a guidance counselor gives to a student. So that is also in itself a kind of systemic like discrimination, a systemic inequality there. And I think someone else mentioned a question or a comment about code switching. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think Joseph, you made a comment about how code switching is like an essential social survival tool for non-white Americans, not exclusive to Black Americans. Absolutely. Yes. Like I think in any culture, in any country you go to, actually, there's always like different regions, like dialects, right? Like people can like code switch into those things if they're able to. But people who are obviously able to switch between different dialects or codes, like you're able to kind of manage. I'm thinking in sociological terms now. You're able to manage like different structural holes, which is a concept that explains like there's like different networks, right? And then between those networks, like if you're able to bridge these different networks effectively, you're a very influential like broker like between networks. So that's anyway, that's an illustration using code switching. But I'll hand it off now to the next
Hold on,
question.
Grace. I want to answer a question that's in the chat. Janetta said,
yeah.
Jeanette said, do you think going back to segregated education would benefit urban schools? Based on the history that I've learned from Ms. Darrell and Ms. Diane, I don't think that would be beneficial. I mean, it would seem like it would be beneficial because then at least all the people in the school would look like us. Hopefully, they would all care about us. If Black faces would recognize Black potential, Black boredom, and all the kids in the segregated school would skyrocket because now we know. But what we have to understand is that the government still funds these schools. And so just like they did when the schools were segregated, 12 kids will be sharing one book and it won't get the resources that it needs. So I don't think that would be a great idea because we're still funded by people who have this disjointed view of our potential. So that's why I don't think that would be a good idea.
So I just want to add on to that. If you look at a lot of the urban areas, the schools still are segregated because they're neighborhood schools. And because of economics, most people, if you look around, I always say one of the few times in your life where you're going to live with somebody who doesn't look like you, may not have the same religion, the same ethnic background, is if you go to residential college. When you come back and go out into the world, you generally live in areas with people that look like you, have the same economic class as you, social class and cultural class. So most of the urban schools still are segregated. And of course, those of you know about the Abbott decision where they're actually just throwing money at urban schools, but money really isn't the solution. is like Lamisha said, it's an attitude. It is to look at every student, whether they're Black, Asian, Latinx, Native American, whatever economic class they come through, they have the same opportunities, and you should have the same type of expectations. You ruin children. You heard Lamisha's story. You ruin children if you don't encourage them and believe that they can exceed from a very early age. So that's what I would say. But then it ties back in is that housing is segregated. In West Windsor, I did a documentary film at West Windsor. Glen Acres was one of the first planned integrated neighborhoods in New Jersey in the late 1950s. So when you look at what's happened, we're not even a generation where things have changed. Martin Luther King was in my lifetime and some of the panelists here lifetime. So we expect things to change, to have change, but when it's 400 years of being segregated, it's hard to think that it's going to change in one generation. I remember doing some research in the 1850s when there was the immigration of the Chinese in California. They had laws on the books that said Chinese and Blacks could not testify against white people in a trial. So Chinese and Black people were treated the same. And in some respects, we are still treated the same. This is a white society. You look at what happened. Someone asked a question about the Capitol riots. You look at what happened in Washington, D.C. You look at what happens with a president who for 4 years has been saying whites are right, white supremacists. None of us you see on this panel is white. So what is that saying about how the president and those people that follow him think of us? So it really behooves us to really understand that we are more united and have things more in common, that we can help each other.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Daryl and Lamisha and Grace. So I think you addressed a lot of the points that I'm going to ask in the next question, but I'm still going to say in case you want to add on more to it. So in contrast to low-income African American families who mostly can only afford housing in inner cities and therefore send their children to newly segregated schools, most Chinese American families, being middle class, can use their economical advantage and choose a better school district. And furthermore, for Chinese kids, the ideal jobs have usually been and still are in STEM fields. And they are usually encouraged, if not pushed, by both the school and the parents to reach at least or even go beyond their full potential. And we know this is not the case with African American kids, especially for inner city schools. And this question is for Diane, Daryl, and Lamisha to add on to this, and also to share with us your stories that when you were in school, you were always expected, expected less than your true potential, which some of you already shared some of that, and were even persuaded away from the STEM fields that you loved, because those fields were for smart kids. Back then, mostly white kids, and perhaps nowadays also Asian kids.
So we had a little discussion about this. I was in elementary school in the 50s, and I'm not only Black, but I'm also a girl. And in this country, science and math were not something girls were supposed to pursue. And so at one point I thought I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't have anybody to push me for me to say, oh, I really could be a doctor. So I ended up being a lawyer. But I think it's because back then, and probably until my daughter went to school, that STEM and the sciences weren't something girls were supposed to go into. And then you layer on top of that, being a Black girl, you must be crazy to think you're going to do that. Not saying that people didn't do that, but you didn't have the encouragement. But at the same time, and I guess I'd ask this of my Asian friends, is that that when my daughter was in high school, it almost seemed like if you were Asian, you had to be in the math and science track, and that maybe you couldn't do anything else, or my goodness, I mean, Grace, I don't know what you might have gotten saying you wanted to be a sociologist and not being a neuropsychologist or something like that. So I think there's tracking for all of us for different reasons.
Yeah, so let me add something else. I went to a fairly good college back in the 70s to the 60s, 60s to the 70s. And unlike what goes on now, which is, I'm much appreciative of how the institutions actually treat the children as you bring your kids up to school and what they're going to do for them. The kind of the idea of the school was to discourage as many of us as they could. All right. So we had a lot of African American students who came to the school looking to be doctors, future doctors. And the school, over the period of time, made it so difficult for them to continue along those tracks that everybody went to something different. All right. They were essentially sitting there saying to you, you are not capable of doing this work, so we're going to move you out to something else. So this is, I'm going to talk just a second about what LaMaisha said about tracking. Tracking is a thing that used to go on in all the schools. And the stories that I have are very much similar to what LaMaisha said. I had friends who were in the classes with me when we first started out. We were more, I would say, segregated as a school then as we went along. And then when we got mixed in with another school from a different district, was a lot of Italian kids, but that was who they were. All of a sudden, I started to see a lot of my friends being tracked out. Oh, he can't sit down in class. Oh, he's making too much noise. Oh, all these other things and stories and such that eventually got these kids tracked out. I had a English teacher who didn't know me, came to the school for the first time, and because I talked a little bit to the people around me, she decided that I was not a good student, and she gave me a 75 as my mark for the school. Now, she had just taken over from somebody else, didn't know me, didn't know anything about me, but decided that I was a bad student. And then we are in the middle of the class, we're talking about, how you did, and she says, well, who got on the honor roll? And of course I raised my hand, and she says, you got on the honor roll? And she realized that she had just made a big mistake, because Mrs. Macmillan, who is my mother, was going to come up and see her, and this was not going to be a good thing for her. All right.
Talk about it.
Up until that point, I had been a 95 student, and she gave me a 75, and she couldn't explain why she did it, other than the fact I was an African American kid in her class, and I probably should have not been there. Right. So tracking is this whole thing that just pushes the kids down the scale, pushes them down the scale to the point where they like LaMaisha said, you come to school and there's nothing that you're learning, because they have already said you are not going to be able to learn. And it happens on a lot of levels. Now, like I said, this was in junior high school that I'm talking about, but it also happened at the college level. And I saw a lot of my friends who wanted to be doctors being told that they weren't ever capable of doing that work. And it was not true. Given the right kind of support, they could have all been doctors.
So my friends who are doctors, what they learn to do is not to be a pre-med student. They learn if they want to go to medical school, they took all the classes they needed to get into medical school, but did not declare themselves pre-med because they knew they'd be weeded out.
Oh, wow. 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 Okay, just to wrap up on that, I'm going to wrap this question into. One of the participants said that, possibly that Grace set a very high bar because she was disappointed about not making an impact on the students. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. It's the perception that just because you want a child to achieve, and you have to set for an African American child, you have to set the bar high. And when you do, we will meet it. But if you set the bar low, you're depriving yourself and that child of your experience and that interaction. Because as Grace said, when she set the bar high and she held it there, 50% of her students were meeting the bar or exceeding it. But if you come into an environment where someone says, well, you should just take them where they are and you should set the bar as to where they are and measure them from where they are, well, then what you're doing is perpetuating the dysfunction, that the educational dysfunction that has crippled them the entire time they've been in this institution. Because as Mr. Darrell has said, as Ms. Diana said, it's not because we can't meet the bar, but if you holding the bar down, or if you're holding the bar on our necks or on our backs, how are we going to meet something you won't raise for us to even stand up? Never mind, jump over, exceed, run over, kick down. It's not possible. As Mr. Darrell said, in Black households, mothers don't play that. Black households, we don't play academic. Academic failure is a no. You might as well tell me I was getting ready to die tonight if I didn't come home with A's on my report card. The reason why I cut school for 30 days, because I knew when that report card came out, it was going to say A. Because look, what am I coming here for? I'm going to come here, I'm going to ace all your stuff, I'm going to turn in all my homework, and I'm going to still get the A. But if that report card was ever in jeopardy, I would have been right in that class. Because Black mothers don't play that. In Black households, we do excellence. That's it. We have no other choice. That's the way we're reared and raised and taught. You have to be better. You have to do more. You have to work harder. And this is drilled into us. And then we get into environments that treat us like we are cartoon characters. Could you imagine how frustrating that is? You got all this potential. You have a home life and a cheerleading section that tells you can be this big. And then you go to school and they teach you like this. So, no. And Grace, I applaud you for holding the bar, and I hope you keep it good.
I really appreciate your stories. Like, I think Lamisha's stories, like Mr. Darrell, Miss Diane's stories, like I had a separate conversation with them prior to today, and I was just so inspired by what they shared. But I 100% agree. I think, Asians like to joke amongst themselves about like moms being called tiger moms, right? But I think it's like, like teachers pretty much need to be like, kind of have the tiger mom mindset too. And I think in a sense, I did bring that mindset to my classroom with my kids in Baltimore. Like I expected the best out of them, and they knew it. Like, and I told them, like, you're all going to like, you're all going to college. You're all going to like achieve like whatever you want to achieve. And I think like a vice principal who came into my classroom once commented, she's like, your classroom feels like a college seminar. And I think she's absolutely right, because I conducted class with my second graders, treating them like kind of almost like university students. So I was talking to them, like, I was like, I expect a lot from you guys, and I know, and they met it. And like Lamisha said, we were able to have some really high level like discussions in my class. I was, so kids, I think any kid, doesn't matter like whatever background you come from, or even whatever zip code you come from. It's just like, when you set those expectations, they're gonna meet it.
Let me tell you something. Your name will be on their lips forever. Like the teachers that held me accountable and raised that bar for me, Mr. Cavalier, my English teacher in Plainfield High, Miss Fuller, my 7th grade teacher, who wasn't going to let me, she wasn't even going to take it from me. She's like, I know your mom. Like my typing teacher in Trenton High, like Mr. Omawali, who literally cussed the class out because I was cutting his class and coming back and acing his test. He's like, I don't know how the rest of you failed this test. You've been looking at me for 30 days and you failed. And one of the students that passed this test, because there were only 2, she hasn't been here. So like your name will constantly be on these students' lips, because they will know how, they will appreciate the challenge and the rigor that you gave them.
Well, thank you. I don't even remember who I asked my last question to, but thank you everyone for the great comments. The next question, in part, address one of the questions raised in the Q&A section, and that is because West Windsor is rather a well-off town, and people here on average have a high level of income. So the question was to see how can we, this panel, really help to address that we can work with how is this going to continue the civil rights fight despite our economical privileges. So the next question we hope to address that if the Chinese residents here in West Windsor can see the connection between why we are middle class and the history of the origin for that from the 1960s civil rights movement, and we come to see that we are in fact the same groups, even though we are Chinese and African Americans, we are in fact the same two major minority groups in America that face common rejections and discriminations to today. So let me get to the question, and we'll get to that even more later. So right now, Chinese Americans do boast one of the highest median annual household income in America among American ethnic groups. And many Chinese residents believe that we pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, meaning we got there because we worked hard. And while in fact it is largely due to the structure set up by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, where mainly Chinese from tax sectors were allowed to immigrate, and therefore guaranteed our middle class status after immigration. Meanwhile, most African Americans still have continued their social economical situation after the 1960s civil rights movement. So this question is for Ying Chao to share with us how your view has changed on this issue over the time from one side dramatically to the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Yame. Maybe continue with the story of coming to America as a graduate student. You know, coming from the academic track, people tend to focus on the so-called meritocracy to emphasize that, oh, yeah, I'm doing well, and therefore I'm supposed to get that. But first of all, to Yame's point, the groundwork of the immigration policy changes and everything else has been a civil rights movement, part of the results of that, right? So that's number one. But also, the meritocracy the argument in the larger society, especially in a complex society. This is what I learned. You know, when I was serving on the school board, in the very beginning, my focus was more on the top students, more so, because they're the ones, winning the competitions and showing how great the school is and everything else, right? But at the same time, as I became more familiarized with the entire school district, knowing the students' populations and knowing the performance distributions, I started to shift over to more of the general population and students at the bottom and also in the middle of the pack. So I think as much as so this is maybe the main shift for me, is that I focus on, again, meritocracy, which is not wrong. But at the same time, we have to look at some of the things that we should be able to provide the same opportunity with everybody else. So I think a lot of the panelists mentioned about the encouragement from the teachers and the environment itself. I think that's later on became more of my focus in terms of the school. That is, we need to build an environment that nurtures students to learn and enjoy learning also, and also become more open-minded about the environment, the world we're living in, and become a lifelong learner, learning to become open-minded and interacting with other people. So I think that's sort of the mindset shift for me after serving the public as a school board member for 3 years, that I sort of initially focused on more pure academic performance and maybe the top tier, and to a general population. Of course, we still want our students to be successful, but the focus is push them all up, right? Not just top drawers, but also everybody in the pack. Yeah. So I think that's the experience I can share. Yeah. Back to you, Yame.
Well, thank you for sharing that. This is the last question for the roundtable, and then we will get to more of addressing the questions from the audience. Just like in Chinese families, moms and relatives frequently are the key factors in children's success in African American families. Although I don't know whether you have noticed, only Chinese moms will be called tiger moms for doing that. And that's what Grace was talking about a little bit. And this question is for Lamisha. That you dropped out of high school and you had children and you returned to college. You got your law degree. You are now a lawyer working for the U.S. government. And please share with us how your mom and your relatives and your tight-knit African American neighborhood community together helped you to literally use all the opportunities created by the 1960s civil rights movement for you and really pulled yourself up by your combined bootstraps.
Okay, so misnomer. I don't think that our parents had the civil rights bill in mind because my mom was born in 44. So that was well before the civil rights ever took place. My descendants, because I know for a fact that my either second grade or third grade grandparents were slaves. So they always, what you guys characterize as a tiger mom for you, that has always been who we are as a people in our homes. What tends to happen, and I learned this helping out in Dilley, Texas, at law school when I went down to help in the camps where they have illegal, undocumented people. The perception that immigrants have of African Americans is largely influenced by the narrative they get from America. So America tells you that black people are lazy. I don't know how a people who worked 12 to 24 hours a day and gave you a whole economy could be lazy, because we weren't the ones on the porch drinking lemonade. We was out in the field. I don't know how those two I don't know how you justify that. But so in our homes, when we broke from slavery, because there was so much to overcome, for generations not being taught to read, for it to be a crime for you to teach a black person to read, for it to be a crime for a black person to have a book, for it to be a crime for a black person to be able to write. Once slavery was over and African Americans were in possession of that freedom, they worked tirelessly. So, Mom, you have to go to school. Education, we thought was our way up, it was our way out. It was going to deliver us from this second class, third class citizenship. So, all the time, go to school. If I brought home a B, my mom was like, "Why wasn't it an A? What was you doing that this wasn't an A? What's going on with you?" And it was always me, because my mom raised kids that were respectful of their elders, respectful of adults, respectful of a people in authority. So you don't shoot your mouth off at those people. And so that means there's no issues with the cops. Why am I worried about the cops? I'm worried about Thelma Ross over here. Because if I got problems with Thelma Ross, I got problems. I'm not worried about the cops because I got problems with Thelma Ross. So my generation, we didn't have those kind of interactions where we were always in trouble with the law, because Mom was at home being her tiger mom self, saying, if this don't get done right, we gonna have a problem. And the last thing an African American child wants to have with that kind of mom is a problem. So from that, you get this incessant need to just achieve. You got to make the grade. You have to do it. There is no exception. You have no excuses, because as I explained to you when we first had this conversation, Miss Diane and Mr. Darrell went through a level of discrimination that I don't have to put up with. When people saw Mr. Darrell in his college dorm and they turned their noses up at him or was shocked because their son was dorming with him, I didn't have to endure that. So when I go to school after Mr. Darrell and Miss Diane have done all that work and suffered all that heartache, when I go to school, I have to go to make them proud, because I'm not just carrying my mother and my father and my family. I am the symbol, because Black people are always judged as a group. You don't see us as individual people like fingers. You see us as a group. So if one of us does something wrong, everybody did it wrong. And if one of us does something bad, everybody did it bad. So we go with that burden on our back, thinking that, or convinced that you got to do this because you're a reflection on our entire race. So we don't go to school with an underachieving methodology, intent, persona. We are going to knock that thing out of the park because we got a mom to make proud. I got to make Miss Diane proud, Mr. Darrell proud, my grandma proud, my great great grandpa proud. Martin Luther King, got to make him proud. The four black girls that died in an Alabama church, I got to make sure that wasn't in vain. There is a lot on an African American child to succeed. So you asked me how I dropped out of school and then went right back because, okay, I was bored. That wasn't my fault, but I always knew I wanted to be something. I always knew I was capable. I just knew I wasn't being challenged. And I didn't drop out with D's and F's. I dropped out with A's and B's because I'm like, there's nothing else for me to do here. They got nothing new for me. They still talking about Christopher Columbus. I'm in the 12th grade. When we going to get past that? Fast forward to college, you ain't even find nothing. So you spent 12 years of my time telling me about a guy who didn't find nothing? Because I don't know how you discover a land people are already on, but that's a different story. So I always knew I wanted to be either a lawyer or a doctor. I knew since I was 7. I liked helping people, but around 13, I figured out I was squeamish. So I was like, we're going to do this law thing. And so that was always the goal. Anybody that knows me from way back, is like, she always talked about this. She always said that this was what she was going to do. So when I graduated law school at 47, all my friends from grade school that knew me growing up said, I cannot believe you did this. You always said you were going to do this. Because I always knew I was going to do this. And there was going to be nothing that was going to deter me from that path. Because I had a family and I had that support. And we weren't worried about the law. We had a history to overcome. And that's what drove us.
Well, thank you, Lamisha. And Diane and Daryl, I really want to hear about your stories that your moms did when you get home, the first thing when you get off the bus. Do you want to share that?
I can share that because I guess I'm the one that went on the bus.
I went on a bus.
You went on a bus too? No, sorry. Okay, so generally speaking, my mother. Well, all right. Let's go back from the very beginning because part of it is I lived in a set of projects where everybody knew everybody else. All right, and this is the whole "takes a village to raise a child" thing. That you know that by the time you get off the bus and to the apartment you're going to, Mrs. McMillan has heard all the stories of the things that you did at school today. So you better not have stories that she's not going to appreciate. All right. And so she spent a lot of time with me with the books I was reading and things like that. We read Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 6th grade. She made sure that I understood everything about that book because it was such, I guess, what do you call it, a lodestone or something that was about the African American experience in the United States. Okay, so she made sure I knew that. That was actually also my first black teacher, my first male teacher, and he was black, and that was a tremendous motivator for me. That Mr. Brown, his name was Mr. Brown, was actually there taking us through this and getting us to read books. And we read Hiroshima. We read Catcher in the Rye in the 6th grade with the appropriate framework for us to learn it. But he took us through that. And my mother was always there to help me understand what was actually going on there. So I always had somebody at home who was trying to make sure I knew what was going on, even to the extent that she really kind of took me through a certain portion of my high school years because the school I was in was pretty intense. And she helped me understand essentially, what I was going through and what was going on there. So that really did help.
So Daryl's being modest. He went to one of the best high schools in this country. And it's still one of the best high schools in this country. So he's being modest. So, you know, my mother and his mother are different. My mother grew up in rural America, like I grew up in rural America. She did not finish high school. You know, she would have finished high school in 1952. So if we think it was been hard for me to do something when I graduated in 1970 as a black woman in rural America, it was very difficult for her. So she, along with everyone in my family, I had an aunt that every time she saw my name in the newspaper for making honor roll, she gave me money, and she didn't have money to spare. So I, like Daryl, grew up in a village in my family that pushed me. And then when I became a mother, I did the same thing with our daughter. We could put her in a fancy private school. We could move to West Windsor to go to one of the best schools. But I also knew that she needed to have the support from home. She used to say, "Mommy, why are you always talking about black this and black that?" Because you're not getting the history of how proud and the accomplishments that we've made to this country and this world in school. And so you know, I think, and I'm sure you do in your homes, is that you influx your children with pride in your culture, the ability of what to do, because unfortunately, this country, for the most part, is very myopic in terms of who is successful and what the culture of this country should be. So we as parents, you're tiger moms, I'm a panther mom, we do the things that we do to make sure our children can be as successful as we can. And I think the other thing you have to realize that there are roadblocks. For the black community, there are certain types of roadblocks to prevent children from excelling. I used to hate the thing when they say, "Oh, well, you're an exception to the rule." Right. I'm not an exception. I just got lucky to be able to get through the maze. And I'm sure you can say that in the Asian American community as well, is that, you know, a lot of kids who might want to be in arts and music, but they see that they look at you and you're Asian, so you have to be in the science. So everyone has roadblocks and things we have to kind of get through and get around to be able to have our full potential. And I think as humans, that's what we really need to look at, the humanity in someone, and understand the uniqueness in someone, understand the uniqueness, the commonality, but the differences. I mean, I have a different culture, you have a different culture, but we should be able to respect each other as a human. So that's what I have to say.
And that's why Miss Diane is my idol. Like that. She said I'm a Panther mom. I love it. Oh my God.
Hey, Diane. So that's all the questions I have for the roundtable. And so I'm just going to briefly wrap up. To end back to where we started, Chinese Americans. And this is also, we hope that this seminar what we hope we can achieve with this seminar. So Chinese Americans and African Americans, we suffered similar but distinct rejections and or discriminations in early American history. And now, with the China virus labeling and George Floyd's killing, they just continue to remind us that despite our economical differences, we are still similar in being the two major minority groups in America that face common rejections and discriminations. So we hope that this seminar can help us to understand each other better. And with that, we can work together to improve equality for all in America. And I hope this can help to address the question in the Q&A section, is that how can our messages, for our community how can we have our community members come to recognize and continue to fight for civil rights despite our economical privileges. And we hope that our roundtable can at least achieve this for Chinese Americans and hopefully other ethnic groups as well. And I'll turn over to YZ for questions. And we have a question from the pre-submitted questions before. which, yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Yame, with the first question maybe you received.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the questions I got from email before was, how do Chinese youth who have immigrated to the United States adapt to the social environment? And I think Grace would like to comment on this.
Sure, very briefly. Yeah, I think just for a lot of Asian Americans who, whose parents like come here, first generation immigrants, in my own experience, and I can tell from my peers' experiences, a lot of them definitely grew up in districts where they were often like maybe the only, Asian kid in the class. And so I think that definitely there is a stigma that like comes with that. So I think there's a common joke I remember hearing growing up, like kids would say, like some Asian American kids, like like we use the term ABC. It's like some ABCs would say, like meaning American born Chinese, would say, oh, I'm a banana, because they would say like, oh, I like, they would joke about being a banana, meaning like they are yellow on the outside but white on the inside. But I think that's a very telling comment, because that shows that Asian Americans who were born here or who came here at a very young age and grew up here feel the pressure to integrate into white society, right? And what is considered white America. And they feel like if they don't do that, like they're not going to be accepted, like in their society, in American society. So that's I think like some people have even commented to me, like they're like, Grace, like you're one of those Asian Americans that actually like still relates very strongly to your heritage and like your Chinese or your Asian background, because you speak Chinese fluently, whereas a lot of Asian Americans who grew up here like do not speak Chinese like much at all. So I think that's just a quick comment on this.
Yeah, I probably can add a few points there, Grace, if I may. So fast forward, our current situation in our district is a little bit different. We got a very high population, Asian population students. I think it's more than 50%, primarily from Southern Asian like Indian descendant and then Chinese. So there's a bit of the flip of that. That is that in my observation, the new challenge is that in that kind of environment, how can you break the boundary? What I call it, in a way, it's almost like a self-segregation. The students coming from the same background tend to hang out together more so than cross, which is kind of natural, because it's only natural for people to associate and make friends with the students from the same background. But at the same time, I think that's one thing that as parents and community, we should encourage the cross-background, cross-culture communication. So, which is what we're doing now today, right? But I think this newer student, it's almost like so many layers and so many bubbles. Even among the Chinese American students, there could be segregation between ABCs and students like coming as a college student, like Yame, and also students as myself coming after college. So they will have different layers even among themselves. They may look the same, but if they, in terms of the social status, not social status per se, but in terms of social circle, they tend to have a bit of a unique culture. Again, not wrong, but something as a new society we need to think about. I think how to encourage again the cross-boundary communication. Yeah, that's my thought. All right, I think we can continue to address some of the questions. I saw lots of good comments and questions through the chat, but I think that the panelists have pretty much addressed all of them throughout. Yeah.
Questions in Q&A.
Yes. There's 3 questions on Q&A, which we're going to talk about. 2 questions from Qian Huang. We touched upon the first one. I think the Capitol riots can trace the root from 1965. I mean, we're talking about it briefly, but who wants to take that? Maybe.
I think you can go back further than 1965.
Okay.
you really, so, I'm sort of an amateur student of American history. And when you look at right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, period, when the northern states were still enforcing the change between the enslaved and and that blacks started become elected to offices because they got the right to vote. And there was a rise of white mobs, similar to what you saw in DC, similar to what you saw in Michigan, who actually would shoot, kill, and run black people out or intimidate them so that they wouldn't vote. You have seen that. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been now watered down, you see that. So you see what happened in Georgia when Stacey Abrams ran for governor, the disenfranchisement of blacks. And even though Georgia now is saying, well, we had a fair election, they're already in the legislature trying to roll back absentee voting, early voting, and you see that across the country. So what you saw in DC is a physical manifestation of what has been going on certainly since 1965, because those people were around back then. But it's a pattern that's been happening throughout this nation, is that only a few are supposed to be the ones that be able to vote and run this country, and the rest of us are supposed to take whatever we take, and that's the reality. And that is what was going on in DC.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah.
Hi,
Move on.
Leslie, could I
Go
add
ahead.
just a little bit?
Sure,
Miss
go ahead.
Diane is absolutely right, and I'm so glad she took the lead on that. But as she says, not only are they rolling back those protections that we gained, what people don't realize is America is still enforcing implicitly a slavery subculture, like things that were prohibited under black codes and under slave codes. They're still trying to do that stuff now. They're just doing it in another way. And because we don't know our history and we don't know anything about slavery is this story we heard. Nobody actually reads to find out, or am I helping to perpetuate the very thing that African Americans are supposed to be free from? That's why that's why you see the acting out that you see.
Thank you, Marcia, for the additional comment. The next question from Chen Huang again. After civil rights movement, America became a land of racial equity. This made many white supremacists angry. These people see Trump as a savior to their lost privilege or paradise. That is why they were so desperately keep Trump as the president. I know, I mean, this is a panel, we don't necessarily get into the political, but that's the question from the audience. I would greatly appreciate the view from you, especially the one who lived in civil rights movement. Who wants to take on that question? Maybe Dara?
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure what the question is. This was a statement of that these things are going on still, right?
Yeah. The question, I would appreciate the view from you, especially the one who lived civil rights movement.
Well, okay, so yeah. I'll start to answer you. She's going to answer better than I do, so we'll do that. Okay. So my take on it is that it has been and continues to be that there was a point in time, I think, in the time that I actually got into the school I went to, that things look like they might be really looking up, that there'd be a big change, but as you kind of attend these institutions and you see the way they work and you see the types of things that have gone on. I mean, I went to school in another nice school, but we came out there one day and the Confederate flag is flying from the flagpole. And we had to remove it from the flagpole. And the guy said to me, "Oh, I like the design." You know, I know darn well and good he knew what that flag meant. And that he was trying to say that we don't belong there, and why are we there? Okay, so those types of things continue to go on to this day.
Well, again, you have to go back to the founding of this country. This founding of this country is built on the principle of white property male owners. None of us on this panel is a white male property owner. So that's what is infused in the DNA of the culture, the institutions. And so when any of us go beyond what they believe our station should be, we're taking something away from them. Look at what's going on in the Asian community, where people are suing, saying, you're letting in too many Asians into our schools. Affirmative action, the reversal of affirmative action. They think because I take a seat, I've taken a seat from one of them. Because you've taken a seat, you've taken a seat from one of them. So we have to remember that's what we're fighting against. But we should be fighting together, not in individual silos, because this country was not designed, was not built, and does not really want us to be full participants on every level. So we have to fight it. We have to work for it. So one of the things Martin Luther King said, we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And the only way we can get there is if we work together.
Great. Thank you, Diane and Doll. Last question we kind of touched upon a little bit from William Dory. Given the high average household income in our West Windsor and Plainsboro communities, what message do you have for our community members when it comes to recognizing and continuing the fight for civil rights despite our economic privileges? Anybody want to jump in
I
there?
can start this one,
Yep.
and anybody can
Go
jump
ahead.
in.
Mhm.
Like I said before, I probably didn't say it here, but civil rights can't begin when somebody dies. You can't start fighting once somebody's body hit the floor. So after George Floyd is murdered, it's too late to start fighting for equality, because George Floyd is dead. Breonna Taylor is dead. Philando Castillo is dead. We have to fight for these people and for their rights, and for every American while we're alive. And you can't acquiesce to certain forms of bias and discrimination and then wonder why people are being gunned down unarmed. Wonder why people are being disenfranchised. Because it's the things you look away from that, as long as they're not touching you, you're not really concerned. So when we see these things, we need to call it out. We need to say what it is. If we're in West Windsor and some child is not getting the educational opportunities that they should, we need to call it out. If we're at work in West Windsor and someone is being discriminated against or treated unfairly, even if we're not African American, we call it out. When I worked at certain places and maybe my counterpart who was not minority, she did something wrong, and so then they started trying to freeze her out. Well, I'm not involved with that, but I know that whatever information I have, because she's my counterpart, I'm gonna make sure she has, because I'm not okay with her being treated like that, because I know that if I allow them to treat her like that, eventually they're gonna treat me like that. And so I had to be there for her in those moments, because not because because I'm African American, at some point they may try to do it to me, but I don't want to be part of the problem. I don't want to look at what's happening to her, know it's wrong, and look away. Because hopefully if it happens to me, she won't look away. And we have to have that kind of social responsibility to each other.
So one of the things Martin Luther King said is that he wished that one day his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I think that's something that we can all remember. And it's the humanity. We have to, the reason George Floyd could be brutally murdered the way he was is because that person didn't see him as a fellow human. And too often we don't see each other as fellow humans, that just because this outer casing may look different, we got the same heart, we have the same blood, we have the same desires of our children, we have the same desires for our elders, we want the best for our children, we want to have clean water, clean air, we want all that stuff. And so the thing of it is, when you look at me and when I look at you, to remember that we really want the same thing, and that we all want to be able to live the best that we can, and hopefully do good by others. So that's really, I think that's really it is in a nutshell. And unfortunately, many in this country and other countries as well don't remember that. And you have people in power who don't remember that. And I think it's up to us, those of us that do understand it, to try to instill it in our children, try to instill it in our community. You know, as Lamisha said, when someone is mistreating someone, don't sit back and not say anything. You know, get involved, because the Holocaust happened because of people stayed back and didn't get involved. And so I think we have, and it's individual and it's everyday, and it adds up. If everybody does whatever they think they can do, it adds up and it can change. But we all have to really sort of work towards it.
Thank you, Diane.
And by re-emphasizing that the Chinese community really and the African American community has long relations dating back all the way back to the MLK Day issue that we are talking about today, in observance of that. I want to emphasize again that we can come here because of the law passed by the Civil Rights Movement from under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Immigration and Nationality Act. Without this law, we wouldn't have been here when the 105 immigration per person per year immigration quota was lifted. And this goes also for Indian residents in West Windsor. And the Indian residents also came after this law that was passed under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement. So we owe a lot to their efforts, and now we face common problems. We are not separated. We cannot be our own groups. We are together on this.
Yeah, thank you, Yan-Mei, for the additional comment. We have one last question from Sunny Wang. It is argued that political correctness is I think you mean reverse discrimination against the white people in US. I'd like to hear our panelists' comments on that.
I can start.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So sometimes I laugh, and I'm not laughing at you, Sonny. I'm laughing at the thought pattern and the thought process, because I don't understand how telling the truth about something that is a factual happening, like Chinese people built the railroads. How is that? If I tell you the truth, and that's the truth, because we can document it, we got papers, we got all the stuff that said that happened. How could someone consider that to be reverse discrimination against white people? You have to go on YouTube and listen to, there's a book called White Fragility. And on YouTube, the author of that book, who is a white woman, goes through and gives you an overview of the book. But one of the most poignant things she says is that in this country, there are many white people who don't know their history. And they're the only ones who get to walk around there without knowing their history and blame other people for it. So what you have to not be afraid of is, especially when your information is accurate, people are going to lob all kinds of nonsensical things at you because of white fragility. I don't want to take responsibility for this. I don't want to own this. I want to believe that all of this happened because I pulled myself up on my bootstraps. When there's a culture that gave you the land, so they gave you the sole of the boots. There's a culture that gave you the leather for the boots. There's a culture that gave you the zippers or the buttons on the boots. There's another culture that gave, like, everybody else put the boots together, and there's probably a culture that put the boots on your feet. So we have to tell the truth, because if we don't tell the truth, then people get to live in this lie that, oh, I did this all on my own without any help. When, let's take it back to Native Americans, without Native Americans helping the first colonists, those colonies, when they first were immigrating over here, they died out because they didn't know how to work the land. They first came over as penal colonies, so it wasn't like they was coming over just to find new land. How you find something that somebody else is already on, I have no idea, but okay, that's another conversation. But so when they came over, without the help of the Native Americans, they don't even know how to cultivate the land. So that's a truth that has to be told. Without the land that you took via genocide, you don't have a country. Without the labor from the slaves, you don't have an economy. And at the constitutional meeting, if slavery is not on the table, America has no identity. So these are truths that just have to be told.
So I think the thing of it is that, again, you look at history, is that current contemporary white Americans do not understand white privilege because they were never taught the reality of how this country was formed and how it was built. So for someone to say reverse discrimination means that we are taking something from them that is theirs and not ours. And that goes back to white privilege. And since they don't understand that they have white privilege, they can then say, well, you Asians are taking our spots. You blacks are taking our spots. When this country supposedly is founded on a land of the free and home of the brave, so that everyone who comes to our shores is supposed to be able to participate in the fruits of this country. So how could there be reverse discrimination? So I think part of it is that white Americans have to learn their own history, the true history, and take responsibility for what this country has become. And if they really want something better than what it is, they have to take the steps to do that. I cannot, nor do I, try to help you solve your problem. It is your problem. It is not my problem. Until you realize that yours is a problem and you come to me to say, can we work on this together? There's not anything I'm going to be able to do. I can, of course, excel at what I can do, but I can't solve your problem. And that's really what it is. And I think we, as people who are not the dominant class, a dominant ethnic group, because I am not a minority, because there are a whole lot of black people in this world, and you all ain't minorities because there are a whole lot of Asians in this world. So we're just not the dominant ethnic group, and we need to work together. We really need to work together to really make this country what it was designed, what some people thought it could be, and we're not there yet. And what we saw over this last 4 years, what we saw over the summer, clearly exposed to, I think, people who didn't really realize there was a problem because they didn't live in neighborhoods. They were fed facts that said, well, I don't know why they can't do what I did, because they raise themselves up their bootstraps. They don't work hard enough because they didn't see the underbelly of this country. And now more people have seen the underbelly of this country. The question becomes, what are they going to do about it?
Well, a major part of this is that people have been lied to for so long that they don't understand what their history is. And that's when somebody comes to me and talks to me about these things, I just have to say that you don't know what the story is. And you have been lied to for a very long time about what the history of the United States is, so that you have no framework in which to put this kind of information. So yeah, of course, it's going to be reverse discrimination, and it's bad for you because you don't understand what role you play within it in the first place. And the one thing that I guess is a flashpoint for me is, well, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. It happened so long ago. No, you are participating in it right now, and you are reaping the fruits that have been laid before because you just don't understand. Right? So that's it.
And the reality is that what we take for granted in this country, some of the institutions, some of the philosophy, some of the culture, China is how many years old? Africa has been around for how long? So, I'm just saying, we've been around longer.
Miss Diane, I'm in love. Stop.
Yeah, I want to also ask for Grace's input, but I remember one research I read last year. This is a recent study. What they did was they sent out the resumes, fake resumes, like with a white-sounding name versus minority names, and clearly the return response was higher for the white-sounding names. So that just shows just not necessarily by law or rules, but just by humans' perception. That is still kind of there. Yeah.
Okay, so I will add that to that because coming out of school, I was looking for jobs. And of course, back then you had to call up the organizations and talk to them. You say, what do you have available? Blah, blah, blah. I got some advice from somebody who was like a guidance counselor or somebody who was helping people coming out of school. The first thing he told me is, you've got to raise the octave of your voice and speak faster because I can tell you're an African American person and therefore you will never ever get the job. And of course I sat back and said, whatever. But I listened to him. And the very next time I talked to somebody on interview, they wanted me to come right down. All right. And of course it does help that my last name is McMillan, and Darrow. So I didn't have an ethnic name at that point. And so it changed what it did. Oh, okay. Let me tell you another story. Sorry. I have to tell the story. So my name is Darrell McMillan. My roommate when I was a junior advisor to kids was Ramsey Chew. Okay. So when the parents came in and they walked down the hall, they were shocked because they expected an Asian American and an Irish guy in the room. And they ran into us. Okay. I mean, of course, it didn't help that I was playing James Brown on the record player at the same time, but they were shocked and amazed. And at first, I didn't understand what was going on. And then I thought about it for a couple of seconds, and I realized they never thought they would have African American people taking care of their kids as they went to the school.
I had a similar experience in law school. So the first day of law school, you had the pieces of paper with everyone's name on it. So I go, oh, there's my name. And people looked at me because I have an Italian last name. And I went to a very good school. And they were shocked to see that I looked the way I looked because they didn't expect a black woman to show up to that law school, particularly since I had an Italian last name and I went to a very good school. So it's the same kind of thing.
Liz, you have anything to add to that?
Honestly, I think the other panelists have covered it really well. I mean, I can just cite some research, but I think personal stories are more interesting.
It is great, a personal story. I think we are at the end of the questions. I know there are a couple of things on the chat, but I think we got them all addressed. So at this point, I would say we already run over time, by the way, but I think that the discussion is so lively and so interesting. I would love to continue. At the same time, we have a pretty sizable audience. I guess we have to return to our normal life nowadays. But this kind of conversation, I think, is extremely helpful to build a bridge. And just the personal story, to Grace's point, is more powerful because you're listening to it. You're kind of obviously one person can never live through another person's true life experiences, but through this kind of personal interaction and personal story, we can get a glimpse of it. I think that's where I think ultimately people can change their mindset. Because after all, I believe everybody is quote unquote biased because you and we all live in our own life experiences. It's very difficult to put ourselves completely in other people's shoes, like starting from elementary school all the way to college and graduate school and law schools. So that's why I believe this kind of communication is extremely important for us to ultimately understand one another, including people holding some different opinions, right? So this is where I also believe if Martin Luther King lives today, he would probably say, go across the aisle on all dimensions, including political beliefs, because ultimately we have to come together to become a humanity altogether. It's not about completely political right or wrong, but ultimately people have to be able to break the wall down and to be able to communicate to one another at a human being level, right? So that's my kind of feeling after this discussion, but I'm going to kick back to our host, Dr. Yamei Wang. I want to express my appreciation because this was her idea, and she kind of worked tirelessly to bring us together.
Thank you,
Yamei. Back to you, Yamei, to close it, to wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And I thank everybody for talking with me. This project has went on for more than half a year, and we nonstop, and I have learned so much. And I was the other person, of all these questions, I was the person that will be asking a lot of these questions, I will say half a year ago or a year ago. And then it was the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened this year that taught me and made me, motivated me to organize this, because I realized the importance that we have to work together. And we do not understand the history, a lot of the histories that we need to understand as immigrants. We need to understand the history. Yeah, the MLK is a good start for it. So thank you for everyone, all the panelists, and I will say good night to all of you, and I hope we continue our conversation for the future.
All right, thank you all. Thank you for your participation, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you, Yamei.
Thank you, Yang Mei.
I'm just gonna save the video file, and I want to see whether I can save the Q&A file too for future.
All right.
Figure out how to do that.
If you can get us the chat also, I'd like to see what it was said.
Yeah,
I didn't see.
I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
And also, we should get together after the pandemic.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. I would love to talk to you guys in person.
Right, actually, you're the only one.
And also to stay in touch.
Right.